The metallic taste lingered in my mouth as I stared at the laboratory report in my trembling hands. The words seemed to blur together through my tears, but 3 lines stood out with devastating clarity. Detected. Industrial-grade methylene chloride. Concentration, 47 parts per million. Source, expressed breast milk sample. My 6-month-old daughter, Emma, lay sleeping peacefully in her crib, oblivious to the poison that had been flowing through the milk I'd been so proudly providing her for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The milk I'd pumped religiously every 3 hours. The milk I'd stored so carefully in labeled bottles. The milk my husband Mark had been contaminating with chemicals from his workplace. My name is Sarah Mitchell. And until 3 days ago, I thought I was living the perfect suburban life in Riverside Heights, Oregon. Mark and I had what everyone called a fairy tale marriage. He was the successful marketing executive at Cascade Chemical Industries, driving his BMW to work each morning in perfectly pressed suits. I was the devoted wife who'd temporarily stepped back from my career to focus on our newborn daughter, spending my days in yoga pants and nursing tops, managing our pristine craftsman home with its white picket fence and manicured garden. To our neighbors, we looked like the ideal young family, the kind featured in lifestyle magazines about work-life balance and modern parenting success stories. But perfection, I'd learned, was often just an elaborate mask hiding something rotten underneath. The first crack in our facade had appeared 6 weeks ago, when Emma started experiencing unexplained symptoms. Excessive crying, difficulty sleeping, unusual rashes that appeared and disappeared without warning. Our pediatrician, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, had initially attributed it to normal infant adjustments, but as the symptoms persisted and intensified, she'd grown increasingly concerned. Emma's weight gain had stalled, her usual bright alertness had dimmed, and she'd developed a persistent cough that defied every treatment we tried. The breaking point came last Tuesday when Emma had what could only be described as a seizure. I'd been changing her diaper when her tiny body suddenly went rigid, her eyes rolling back as her limbs began to convulse. The ambulance ride to Pacific Northwest Medical Center felt like an eternity, Emma's small form looking impossibly fragile against the white sheets of the gurney. Mark had met us at the hospital, his face a mask of concerned confusion that I now realized was perfectly rehearsed. Dr. Rodriguez had been thorough in her examination, running every test imaginable to determine what could be causing Emma's declining health. When standard blood work revealed elevated levels of certain enzymes suggesting exposure to toxins, she'd made a suggestion that seemed almost absurd at the time. "I know this might sound unusual," she'd said, her kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses, "but I'd like to test your breast milk. Sometimes environmental contaminants can concentrate in breast milk, and if Emma's being exposed to something, that would be the most likely source." I'd agreed immediately, pumping a fresh sample right there in the hospital room while Mark paced by the window, his usually confident demeanor replaced by what I'd interpreted as worried restlessness. Now I understood it had been anxiety of an entirely different kind. He'd known exactly what those tests would reveal, because he'd been the one putting the chemicals in my milk storage containers. The toxicology report I now held in my shaking hands detailed the presence of multiple industrial chemicals, substances that had no business being anywhere near a nursing mother, let alone in concentrations that could harm an infant. Dr. Michael Foster, the toxicologist who'd conducted the analysis, had called me personally that morning, his voice heavy with concern and barely contained anger. "Mrs. Mitchell," he'd said, "these levels don't occur naturally. Someone deliberately introduced these substances into your milk supply." The room seemed to spin as the full implications of his words sank in. Someone had been poisoning my baby through me. Someone with access to our home, to my carefully labeled milk storage system, to industrial-grade chemicals. Someone who knew exactly when I pumped, when I stored the milk, when I'd be away from the house long enough for them to contaminate it without being caught. The list of people with that level of access was devastatingly short. Mark had left for work that morning with his usual kiss on my cheek and promised to pick up dinner on his way home, completely unaware that I'd received the toxicology results. As I sat in our kitchen, still in my pajamas at 2 in the afternoon, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who'd spent the last 6 months apologizing for everything, who'd blamed herself for Emma's health problems, who'd accepted Mark's increasingly condescending comments about my postpartum struggles, was dissolving. In her place, something harder and infinitely more dangerous was crystallizing. I'd been playing the role of vulnerable new mother so completely that I'd almost forgotten who I really was underneath the sleepless nights and endless feedings. But the laboratory report in my hands was bringing back memories of my former life, the career I'd put on hold when Emma was born, the expertise that had made me one of the most sought-after food safety consultants on the West Coast. For 5 years before my pregnancy, I'd worked under the professional name S.M. Chen, investigating contamination cases for major corporations, government agencies, and law firms. I'd testified before Congress about industrial chemical exposure, published papers on toxin detection in food supplies, and built a reputation for uncovering the truth in cases where powerful people preferred it stayed hidden. Mark knew about my consulting work, of course, but he'd never understood the full scope of what I did or how good I was at it. To him, it was just Sarah's little chemistry hobby, something cute that brought in some extra money, but nothing compared to his serious corporate career. He'd never seen the high-security laboratories where I'd worked, never witnessed the federal agents who'd sought my expertise, never understood that behind my soft-spoken demeanor was a mind trained to detect deception in its most sophisticated forms. The irony was almost laughable. Mark had married a woman who specialized in exactly the kind of investigation that would expose his crimes, then proceeded to commit those crimes right under her nose, confident that pregnancy and new motherhood had rendered her harmless. He'd underestimated me so completely that he'd grown careless, leaving traces of evidence that would have been obvious to any competent investigator. The question now was how long this had been going on, and why he was doing it. I moved through our house with new eyes, seeing details I'd previously dismissed as normal wear and tear or minor accidents. The way certain breast milk storage containers showed faint discoloration around the seals. The industrial smell that sometimes clung to Mark's clothes, which he'd explained as normal workplace exposure. The way he'd insisted on organizing my pumping schedule, claiming he wanted to be supportive but actually ensuring he knew exactly when fresh milk would be available for contamination. In our master bedroom, I searched through Mark's belongings with methodical precision, looking for any evidence that might explain his motives. His laptop was password protected, but his desk drawers revealed a troubling pattern of financial documents. Credit card statements showed charges at expensive restaurants during lunch hours, hotel bookings for weekends when he'd claimed to be at business conferences, jewelry purchases. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That had never appeared as gifts for me. The classic signs of an affair, but that still didn't explain why he'd escalate to poisoning our daughter. The answer came when I found an insurance policy tucked behind his other documents. A life insurance policy on Emma that I'd never seen before. The coverage amount made my blood run cold. $500,000, with Mark as the sole beneficiary. The policy had been purchased 2 months after Emma's birth, around the time her mysterious symptoms had first appeared. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was more horrific than I'd initially imagined. My phone rang, startling me from my investigation. The caller ID showed Dr. Rodriguez's office, and I answered with hands that were surprisingly steady given the circumstances. "Sarah, I wanted to check on how you're processing the test results," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice warm with professional concern. "I know this must be incredibly shocking and frightening." "I'm managing," I replied, though managing felt like an understatement for the cold fury that was building in my chest. "Dr. Rodriguez, I need to ask you something. If someone wanted to harm an infant through breast milk contamination, what would be the most effective approach?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah, that's a very specific question. Are you thinking about pressing charges?" "I'm thinking about making sure this never happens to anyone else," I said, which was true as far as it went. From a medical perspective, how would someone maximize harm while minimizing detection? Dr. Rodriguez's voice became more clinical, her protective instincts clearly engaged. Theoretically, someone would need access to both the milk supply and industrial chemicals. They'd want substances that would accumulate slowly, causing gradual symptoms that might be attributed to other causes. The timing would need to be precise to avoid immediate detection, and they'd need enough knowledge of infant physiology to predict the effects. So this would require planning and expertise. Absolutely. This isn't something that happens accidentally or impulsively. Sarah, I think you should contact the police immediately. What you're describing sounds like attempted murder. After ending the call, I sat in Mark's home office, surrounded by evidence of his deception and attempted murder of our daughter. The woman who'd blamed herself for Emma's health problems was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. Mark had made a fatal error in choosing his victim. He'd married a woman whose entire professional life had been dedicated to exposing dangerous people who thought they were too smart to be caught. I spent the remainder of the afternoon carefully documenting everything I'd discovered, photographing documents, collecting samples from the contaminated storage containers, and building a case file that would have impressed any federal prosecutor. But criminal charges were only the beginning of what Mark was going to face. He'd attacked my child, betrayed my trust, and underestimated my capabilities so completely that he'd left himself vulnerable to a response he'd never see coming. The sound of his BMW pulling into our driveway at 6:30 triggered no anxiety, no fear, no uncertainty about what came next. Mark Mitchell was about to discover that the quiet, devoted wife he'd been systematically poisoning was actually one of the most dangerous adversaries he could have chosen. He'd called me paranoid when I'd worried about Emma's symptoms. Tonight, he was going to learn the difference between paranoia and preparation. As his key turned in the front door lock, I remained seated at the kitchen table, the toxicology report spread before me like evidence in a war crimes trial. Emma slept peacefully in her bouncer nearby, finally safe from the poison that had been destroying her small body for months. Mark's footsteps approached the kitchen, accompanied by the rustle of takeout bags and his usual cheerful greeting. "Hey, honey, I brought Thai food from that place you like," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who'd perfected the art of deception. "How was your day? Emma feeling any better?" I looked up as he entered the kitchen. This man I'd trusted with my life and my daughter's well-being. This person who'd been slowly murdering our child while pretending to be a concerned father. For a moment, I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in our marriage. Handsome enough to be charming, smart enough to be dangerous, and psychopathic enough to poison an infant for insurance money. "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice perfectly calm as I gestured to the laboratory report on the table, "I think Emma's going to be just fine. We finally figured out what's been making her sick." Mark's face remained perfectly composed as he set the takeout bags on the counter, but I caught the microscopic pause in his movements when his eyes landed on the laboratory report. To anyone else it would have been invisible, but I'd spent years learning to read the subtle tells that revealed when someone was lying. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his breathing became just a fraction more controlled, the careful neutrality of his expression that replaced his usual animated warmth. "Laboratory report?" he asked, moving to wash his hands at the sink with deliberate casualness. "What kind of tests did Dr. Rodriguez run this time?" I thought we'd covered everything after Emma's episode last week. I remained seated, watching him perform this elaborate dance of innocent curiosity. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him had spent the better part of a decade developing techniques for exposing industrial contamination conspiracies. The SM Chen who'd testified before Senate subcommittees about chemical safety violations wasn't some distant professional persona I'd abandoned for motherhood. She was still here, sharper than ever, and she'd been analyzing every detail of his performance. "It's a toxicology analysis of my breast milk," I said, letting the words hang in the air between us. Dr. Foster found some interesting compounds. Industrial chemicals that shouldn't exist anywhere near a nursing mother. Mark turned from the sink, toweling his hands with movements that were just slightly too precise. "That's concerning. Could it be environmental exposure? I know there's been construction in the neighborhood, and sometimes those projects can kick up contaminants." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I almost admired his technique. Almost. If I hadn't known exactly what to look for, if I hadn't spent years learning how guilty parties deflected suspicion, I might have actually believed his concerned husband act. But I'd seen this same performance from corporate executives trying to explain away chemical spills, from factory managers denying knowledge of illegal dumping, from politicians claiming ignorance about contaminated water supplies. That's what I thought initially, I replied, picking up the report and scanning it as though seeing it for the first time. But Dr. Foster was very specific about the compounds he found. Methylene chloride, trichloroethylene, benzene derivatives. He said these particular chemicals are used primarily in industrial manufacturing processes, very specialized applications. Huh, Mark said, pulling plates from the cabinet with carefully controlled movements. That does sound unusual. Maybe we should have the house tested for environmental contamination. Better safe than sorry, especially with Emma's health issues. I had to give him credit for maintaining the facade so completely. Even now, with evidence of his crimes literally spread across our kitchen table, he was still trying to gaslight me into believing this was some external threat we were facing together. The concerned father and husband, ready to protect his family from mysterious environmental dangers. It was a masterful performance, and it might have worked on the old Sarah, the one who'd spent months blaming herself for every aspect of Emma's declining health. But the old Sarah hadn't understood what she was really dealing with. The woman sitting here now had access to resources and knowledge that Mark couldn't even imagine. While he'd been busy underestimating his wife as just another suburban mother, I'd been quietly maintaining the professional network that had made me one of the most effective environmental investigators on the West Coast. Actually, I said, reaching for my phone with deliberate casualness, I already called in a favor. My former colleague, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, runs the environmental testing lab at Portland State University. She's sending a team tomorrow to collect samples from the house, the yard, even the air ducts. Full spectrum analysis. For the first time, Mark's mask slipped slightly. The confident smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. That seems like overkill, don't you think? I mean, if it's just environmental contamination, a basic test should be sufficient. Jennifer specializes in industrial chemical contamination cases, I continued, watching his face carefully. She's the one who exposed the Clearwater manufacturing cover-up 3 years ago. Remember that case? Where executives were illegally disposing of chemical waste and trying to blame it on natural groundwater contamination. She developed a technique for tracing chemical signatures back to their specific industrial sources. It's like fingerprinting for toxins. The color drained from Mark's face so quickly that I thought he might actually faint. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white with tension. Sarah, I think you might be overreacting. Emma's been getting better lately, and calling in these kinds of specialists could be expensive. Money isn't really a concern, I said quietly, especially when it comes to protecting our daughter. What Mark didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 4 years of marriage, was that my consulting work had been far more lucrative than I'd ever let on. While he saw my career as a cute hobby that brought in some extra spending money, the truth was that specialized environmental contamination investigations commanded premium rates. My expertise in chemical fingerprinting and industrial toxin analysis had made me wealthy enough that his salary, impressive as it was, represented less than half of our household income. I'd kept separate financial accounts long before Emma was born, partly out of professional habit, and partly because something about Mark's relationship with money had always made me uncomfortable. The way he spent freely on himself while questioning my purchases, the way he assumed he was the primary breadwinner despite never asking about my actual earnings, the way he made financial decisions as though my input was optional rather than essential. Now I understood why he'd been so cavalier about our finances. He'd been planning for a future where Emma's life insurance payout would solve any monetary concerns, where my grief over losing our daughter would make me dependent on his support and guidance. He'd been positioning himself as the strong, stable provider who would help his devastated wife through an unimaginable tragedy. Dr. Foster also recommended that we contact the authorities, I added, still maintaining my conversational tone. He said the levels of contamination he found suggest deliberate introduction rather than accidental exposure. Apparently, there are federal protocols for this kind of investigation. Mark abandoned any pretense of organizing dinner, turning to face me fully with an expression that was trying to project loving concern, but couldn't quite hide the panic underneath. Sarah, honey, I think you might be getting ahead of yourself here. Sometimes these lab results can be misleading, and bringing in federal investigators seems extreme. Does it? I asked, tilting my head with genuine curiosity. Someone has been poisoning our 6-month-old daughter, Mark. Someone with access to our home, knowledge of my pumping schedule, and the ability to obtain industrial-grade chemicals. That sounds exactly like the kind of situation that warrants federal attention. He moved toward me then, his approach carefully non-threatening but unmistakably intended to establish physical dominance in the conversation. It was a technique I'd seen countless times in my professional work, the way guilty parties tried to use proximity and implied intimidation to control the narrative. But Mark had made a crucial miscalculation. The woman he was trying to intimidate had spent years facing down corporate executives with much better lawyers and considerably more to lose. Look, he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to hate over recent months. I know pregnancy and nursing can affect how women process stress and information. Maybe you're seeing patterns that aren't really there, jumping to conclusions because you're tired and worried about Emma. The condescension was so complete, so perfectly dismissive, that I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. This was who Mark really was underneath the charming exterior. A man who would poison his own infant daughter for money, then gaslight his wife when she discovered the truth. A man who thought pregnancy had made me stupid and paranoid, incapable of rational thought or professional competence. You're absolutely right, I said, nodding thoughtfully. Pregnancy and nursing can definitely affect cognitive function. All those hormones, the sleep deprivation, the constant worry about doing everything perfectly for your baby. Mark's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing as he mistook my agreement for capitulation. Exactly. You've been under so much pressure, and Emma's health problems have been stressful for both of us. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Rodriguez about getting you some support, some counseling to help you process all this anxiety. That's such a thoughtful suggestion, I replied warmly. It's lucky for me that I married someone who understands how pregnancy can impact a woman's ability to think clearly. He was nodding along, completely missing the edge that had crept into my voice. Of course, honey, we're a team, and teams support each other through difficult times. Absolutely, I agreed. Although I have to say, it's interesting how selective that cognitive impact seems to be. Because while I was apparently too hormone-addled to function rationally, I was still sharp enough to maintain my security clearance with the Department of Environmental Protection. Mark's expression froze, confusion replacing his patronizing confidence. What security clearance? The one I've held for the past 6 years, I said conversationally. You know, for the consulting work I do, with federal agencies investigating environmental crimes. The work that requires extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and ongoing assessments of mental fitness and professional competence. I could see him struggling to process this information, to reconcile the image of his helpless, hormone-addled wife with someone who held federal security clearances. I thought you just did private consulting for companies. Some of my work is private sector, I confirmed, but about 60% of my cases involve federal investigations. Industrial contamination, illegal chemical disposal, corporate cover-ups of environmental damage. The kind of cases where the perpetrators usually think they're too smart to get caught. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft sounds of Emma breathing in her bouncer and the distant hum of our refrigerator. Mark stood frozen near the counter, his mind clearly racing as he tried to understand how dramatically he'd miscalculated the situation. The thing about federal investigations, I continued, my voice still perfectly calm, is that they're incredibly thorough. When the EPA or the FBI gets involved in a contamination case, they don't just look at the immediate evidence. They examine financial records, communications, travel patterns, purchase histories. They build comprehensive profiles of everyone involved. Mark's face had gone completely pale now, beads of sweat appearing on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Sarah, what are you saying? I'm saying that when Dr. Foster files his mandatory report with the federal authorities tomorrow morning, and when Dr. Walsh's team completes their environmental analysis, The investigation that follows is going to be extremely comprehensive. They'll want to understand exactly how those chemicals got into my breast milk, and they have resources for that kind of investigation that you can't even imagine. I stood up then, moving to check on Emma with the same casual demeanor I'd maintained throughout our conversation. Our daughter was sleeping peacefully, her color much better than it had been in weeks now that she was no longer being systematically poisoned. But here's what I find most interesting, I said, gently adjusting Emma's blanket. According to Dr. Foster's analysis, the contamination levels in my milk have been remarkably consistent over the past several months. That suggests systematic, repeated exposure rather than a single accidental event. Someone has been doing this regularly, methodically, over an extended period. Mark hadn't moved from his position by the counter, his body rigid with tension. Sarah, I think you're reading too much into this. There could be dozens of explanations. Could there? I asked, turning back to face him. Because I've spent the afternoon thinking about those explanations, and the list is remarkably short. It would have to be someone with regular access to our home. Someone who knew my pumping schedule well enough to contaminate fresh milk without being detected. Someone with access to industrial chemicals and enough knowledge about infant physiology to predict the effects. I walked back to the table and picked up one of the documents I'd discovered in his office earlier. Someone who might have recently purchased a life insurance policy on Emma that I'd never heard about. The insurance paperwork hit the table with a soft rustle that seemed deafeningly loud in the silent kitchen. Mark's eyes locked onto the document, and I watched his last hopes of maintaining his innocent facade crumble in real time. You've been very thorough, he said finally, his voice completely different now. Gone was the patronizing concern, replaced by something flat and calculating that I'd never heard from him before. I always am, I replied. It's what made me good at my job, and it's what's going to make this investigation very educational for everyone involved. Mark straightened up, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw his true face. No charming smile, no practiced warmth, just cold intelligence calculating his options. What do you want, Sarah? The question hung between us, loaded with implications that we both understood. This was no longer a conversation between a concerned wife and her lying husband. This was a negotiation between two people who finally understood exactly who they were dealing with. I want to understand why, I said simply. I want to know how long you've been planning this, whether Emma was always the target, or if the opportunity just presented itself when she was born. I want to know if you ever actually loved either of us, or if we were always just part of some elaborate scheme. And if I tell you, then we'll discuss your options, I said, because right now you have very few of them. Part 3. The breaking point. Mark walked to the window overlooking our backyard, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture I'd seen him adopt during difficult phone calls with clients. When he turned back to face me, his expression had shifted again, this time settling into something that reminded me of a defendant finally admitting guilt after months of legal maneuvering. The insurance policy was always part of the plan, he said, his voice eerily matter-of-fact. But Emma wasn't supposed to suffer. The original idea was much simpler. I felt my blood turn to ice, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of professional interrogations had taught me that people revealed more when they felt they were in control of the narrative. What was the original idea? A car accident? He said, as casually as if he were discussing our weekend plans. Something quick, painless. You and Emma together. A tragic loss that would leave me devastated but financially secure. The grief-stricken widower who'd lost everything and had to rebuild his life. The clinical detachment in his voice was more terrifying than rage would have been. This wasn't a man who'd snapped under pressure or made a desperate decision in a moment of crisis. This was someone who'd coldly planned the murder of his wife and infant daughter as a financial strategy. But that plan became complicated, I said, encouraging him to continue. Your driving habits changed after Emma was born, he admitted. You became obsessively careful, always taking the safest routes, never driving when you were tired. And you started using that rideshare service for longer trips instead of driving yourself. The opportunities I'd been counting on just weren't materializing. I remembered the period he was describing, how Mark had seemed frustrated with my newfound caution behind the wheel. He'd made comments about me becoming paranoid, suggested that I was letting motherhood make me overly anxious about normal activities. Now I understood he'd been irritated that his murder plot was being derailed by my responsible parenting choices. So you moved to Plan B, I said. The poisoning was supposed to be gradual, he continued, his tone suggesting he was describing a failed business strategy rather than attempted infanticide. Small amounts over time, just enough to make Emma chronically ill. The idea was that you'd become so focused on her health problems that you'd be distracted, vulnerable. Eventually, there would be a tragic escalation, and the grief would be overwhelming enough that you'd make poor decisions. What kind of poor decisions? Mark's smile was cold and calculated. Suicide, ideally. The devastated mother who couldn't live with the loss of her sick child. It would have been completely understandable, given the circumstances. Everyone would have seen it as a tragedy rather than questioning the timeline too closely. The matter-of-fact way he described planning my death made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to remain focused on gathering information. And if the suicide scenario didn't work? There were contingencies, he said with a shrug. Another accident, perhaps. Or you could have simply disappeared one day, overwhelmed by grief and unable to cope. People would have assumed you'd run away or harmed yourself somewhere private. Either way, I'd have been the tragic survivor, left to raise Emma alone until her health problems eventually became fatal. I stared at this man I'd shared a bed with for 4 years, trying to reconcile the loving husband I'd thought I'd married with the cold-blooded killer standing in my kitchen. How long have you been planning this? Since before Emma was born, he admitted. The marriage was always about positioning myself for the long term. You had professional credentials that made you valuable, financial assets that weren't immediately obvious, and you seemed like the type who'd be easy to manipulate when the time came. The pieces of our relationship began rearranging themselves in my mind, every romantic gesture and loving word recontextualized as part of an elaborate deception. You never loved me. I liked you, he said, as though that was some kind of consolation. You were intelligent enough to be interesting but naive enough to be controlled. And you had resources that I needed access to, connections in the environmental consulting world that could be useful for my real work. Your real work? Mark's expression shifted, and for the first time I saw something like pride in his face. Cascade Chemical Industries isn't just my employer, Sarah. I'm part of a very specific operation that helps companies manage environmental liability in creative ways. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You help them cover up contamination. I help them minimize exposure and maximize profit, he corrected. Sometimes that involves managing information flow. Sometimes it requires eliminating potential whistleblowers. Sometimes it means creating alternative narratives about the source of environmental problems. I thought about my own work, the cases I'd investigated where corporate cover-ups had delayed cleanup efforts and prolonged public health crises. You're part of the problem I've been fighting my entire career. I'm part of the solution to a complex business problem, he replied. Environmental regulations are strangling American industry, and someone has to help companies navigate those challenges pragmatically. By murdering investigators? By eliminating obstacles to profitable operations, he said. Sometimes those obstacles are regulations, sometimes they're activists, sometimes they're consultants who ask too many questions. The full scope of what I was dealing with began to crystallize. This wasn't just about insurance money or a failed marriage. Mark was part of a criminal organization that systematically eliminated environmental threats to corporate profits. My marriage hadn't been a love story that went wrong. It had been a targeted operation from the beginning. How many people have you killed? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Directly? You would have been the first, he said. But I've been involved in operations that neutralized several problematic individuals over the years. Environmental lawyers who were getting too close to sensitive information, government inspectors who couldn't be bought, journalists who were asking dangerous questions. I felt sick, but I forced myself to keep listening. Every detail he revealed was evidence that could be used to dismantle whatever organization he was part of. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Mark's cold smile returned. Because you're not going to live long enough to repeat it to anyone. The threat hung in the air between us, but instead of fear, I felt something like relief. The pretense was finally over. No more games, no more manipulation, no more wondering if I was imagining the subtle cruelties and calculated undermining. Mark had revealed himself completely, and now I could respond accordingly. "That's an interesting assumption," I said calmly. "It's not an assumption," he replied, his confidence returning. "You've been systematically poisoned, along with Emma, Sarah. Lower doses, slower acting, but the same compounds. The fatigue you've been experiencing, the memory problems, the difficulty concentrating that you attributed to postpartum hormones, those were early symptoms of chronic chemical exposure." I felt a chill of recognition. The past few months had been marked by an unusual level of exhaustion and mental fog that I'd blamed on the demands of new motherhood. I'd been to Dr. Rodriguez several times, complaining of symptoms that seemed consistent with normal postpartum adjustment, but had been gradually worsening rather than improving. "How?" I asked. "Your coffee," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Every morning, the same routine. I'd get up first, start the coffee, bring you a cup in bed before you started your day. Small amounts of the same chemicals I was putting in Emma's milk, just diluted enough that the effects would be gradual and easily attributed to other causes." I thought about my morning routine, how Mark had insisted on bringing me coffee in bed as a sweet gesture of husbandly care. How he'd been disappointed on the rare occasions when I'd made my own coffee or skipped it entirely. How he'd suggested I might need to see a psychiatrist when I'd complained about feeling unlike myself in recent months. "The beauty of the approach," he continued, "is that you've been documenting your own decline. All those visits to Dr. Rodriguez complaining about memory problems and fatigue, all those discussions about postpartum depression and anxiety. When you eventually have a breakdown or accident, there will be a clear medical record showing your deteriorating mental state. And Emma would have been taken care of quietly after you were gone," he said with casual cruelty. "A final health crisis, perhaps triggered by the trauma of losing her mother. These things happen with sick infants, especially when their primary caregiver is no longer available to monitor their condition carefully." I absorbed this information with the same clinical detachment I'd used to analyze contamination reports throughout my career. Mark had constructed an elaborate murder plot that would have eliminated both Emma and me, while leaving him positioned as the sympathetic survivor. It was sophisticated, methodical, and might have worked perfectly if he hadn't made one crucial error. He'd underestimated who he was dealing with. "There's just one problem with your plan," I said, standing up and walking to the kitchen sink. "What's that?" I turned on the faucet and began washing my hands with deliberate thoroughness. "I stopped drinking the coffee you made me 6 weeks ago." Mark's confident expression faltered. "What?" "When Emma started getting sick, I became paranoid about everything that might be affecting my milk supply," I explained, drying my hands on a kitchen towel. "I read dozens of articles about how maternal diet and chemical exposure could impact nursing infants. One of the recommendations was to eliminate all potential contaminants from your routine, including coffee that might contain pesticide residues or heavy metals." I moved to the cabinet and retrieved a sealed container of organic coffee I'd been using for the past month and a half. I started making my own coffee with certified organic beans and filtered water, but I didn't want to hurt your feelings about the sweet gesture of bringing me coffee in bed, so I just dumped what you brought me down the sink when you weren't looking. The color drained from Mark's face as he realized the implications. "That's impossible. You've been showing all the symptoms." "Actually, I've been recovering from the symptoms," I corrected. "The fatigue and mental fog started clearing up about 3 weeks ago. I attributed it to Emma sleeping better, but now I understand it was because I stopped ingesting whatever you were putting in my coffee." Mark stepped backward, his careful composure finally cracking completely. "You can't prove any of this." "Can't I?" I asked, moving back to the table where I'd laid out the evidence I'd gathered during the afternoon. "Let me tell you what I can prove, Mark. I can prove that you purchased a life insurance policy on Emma without my knowledge. I can prove that you've been accessing industrial chemicals through your workplace. I can prove that my breast milk contains those same chemicals in concentrations that indicate deliberate contamination." I picked up another document from the pile. I can also prove that you've been making unusual financial transactions over the past several months. Large cash withdrawals, payments to companies that don't seem to exist, travel expenses that don't match your claimed business trips. You've been investigating me, he said, his voice flat with disbelief. I've been investigating us, I corrected. When Emma started getting sick and you suggested we might need to consider financial planning for long-term medical care, I decided to audit our household finances to understand our options. What I found was a pattern of financial behavior that suggested you were either having an affair, planning to leave me, or both. I pulled out bank statements and credit card records that told a clear story of deception. The hotel charges that don't correspond to any business travel you told me about, the restaurant bills for 2 people during lunch hours when you claimed to be in meetings, the jewelry purchases that never appeared as gifts for me. Mark was staring at the documents as though they might disappear if he looked hard enough. Sarah, you don't understand what you're dealing with here. I understand exactly what I'm dealing with, I replied. You're part of a criminal organization that eliminates environmental threats to corporate profits. You married me to gain access to my professional network and financial resources. When that wasn't sufficient, you decided to murder Emma and me for insurance money while positioning yourself as a tragic victim. I moved closer to him, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. What you don't understand is what you're dealing with. You think you married a naive suburban mother who could be easily manipulated and eliminated. Instead, you married someone whose entire career has been built on exposing people exactly like you. The kitchen fell silent, except for Emma's peaceful breathing and the distant sound of traffic on our quiet street. Mark stood frozen, apparently unable to process how completely his careful plans had unraveled. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice calm and authoritative. You're going to tell me everything about your organization. Names, methods, previous victims, ongoing operations. You're going to provide evidence that can be used to dismantle the entire network. And if I refuse? I smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. Then you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison for attempted murder, and I'll use every resource at my disposal to ensure that your associates meet the same fate. Mark's last attempt at control was slipping away, and I could see him struggling to find some leverage, some threat that might give him an advantage in this negotiation. But he'd revealed too much, admitted too much, and eliminated any possibility of returning to his previous facade. You have no idea how powerful these people are, he said desperately. If you move against them, they'll destroy you and everyone you care about. They can try, I replied calmly, but I have something they don't expect. What's that? Federal protection, I said, pulling out my phone. You see, when you're a consultant with security clearance who works on environmental crime cases, you have certain protocols to follow when you discover evidence of criminal activity. I called my federal contact this afternoon and briefed him on the situation. Mark's face went completely white. You called the FBI? I called Agent Robert Chen at the Environmental Crimes Unit, I confirmed. He's my cousin, actually, and he's been hoping for an opportunity to investigate corporate environmental crime networks for years. Apparently, your organization has been on federal radar for quite some time. The final piece of Mark's composure crumbled, as he realized that his carefully planned murder plot had instead handed federal investigators direct access to the criminal network he was part of. He'd been so focused on eliminating a potential threat that he'd never considered the possibility that his intended victim was already connected to the very law enforcement agencies he was trying to avoid. Agent Chen will be here in about 20 minutes, I added, checking my phone, along with a full federal response team and specialists from the Environmental Crimes Unit. I suggest you use that time to decide how cooperative you want to be. Part 4, the strategic planning. Mark collapsed into one of our kitchen chairs, the weight of his situation finally registering completely. For several minutes, he sat in stunned silence while I continued my methodical documentation of evidence, photographing documents and organizing materials for the federal agents who would arrive soon. Emma continued sleeping peacefully in her bouncer, blissfully unaware that her father had been systematically poisoning her for months. How long have you known? Mark asked finally, his voice hollow with defeat. Known what specifically? I replied without looking up from my work. That I was part of the organization. That this whole marriage was an operation. I paused in my documentation, considering how to answer that question truthfully. I suspected something was wrong with our relationship for months, but I attributed it to normal marriage stress and the challenges of new parenthood. The pieces didn't start coming together until Emma got sick, and I began analyzing everything more systematically. It was true, but incomplete. The reality was that my professional instincts had been sending me warning signals about Mark for over a year. Subtle inconsistencies in his stories about work, unusual patterns in his financial behavior, and most tellingly, the way he'd discouraged my involvement in certain types of environmental cases. But you've been preparing for this confrontation, he observed, gesturing at the organized evidence spread across our table. I've been gathering information, I corrected. It's what I do professionally, and it became a survival skill personally when I realized Emma's health problems weren't random. The truth was more complicated than that. While I hadn't known the specific details of Mark's criminal activities, my professional experience had taught me to recognize when someone was systematically undermining an investigation. Over the past several months, Mark had been subtly discouraging me from taking certain consulting cases, questioning my need to maintain federal security clearance, and suggesting that I might want to consider a more traditional approach to motherhood that didn't involve dangerous investigative work. At the time, I'd attributed his concerns to normal spousal worry about my safety and work-life balance. Now I understood that he'd been trying to neutralize my professional capabilities and connections before implementing his murder plan. The irony was that his attempts to isolate me from my professional network had actually made me more suspicious, not less. The federal investigation is going to be comprehensive, I told him, returning to my documentation. They'll examine every aspect of your activities, every connection you've made, every operation you've been involved in. Your best option is complete cooperation. Mark laughed bitterly. Cooperation means death. You don't understand how these people operate, Sarah. They don't leave loose ends. Neither do federal investigators, I replied calmly. Especially when they're dealing with environmental crimes that affect public health. Agent Chen's unit has resources and authority that your criminal friends can't match. I thought about my cousin Robert, whose career with the Environmental Crimes Unit had been marked by successful prosecutions of some of the most sophisticated corporate criminal networks in the country. He'd been frustrated by the limitations of traditional law enforcement approaches to environmental crime, particularly cases where criminal organizations had embedded themselves within legitimate corporate structures. The opportunity to infiltrate and dismantle a network like Mark's would be exactly the kind of case Robert had been hoping for. Not just another corporate executive cutting corners on waste disposal, but an organized conspiracy to eliminate environmental oversight through murder and intimidation. Tell me about Jessica Torres, I said, pulling out another document from my research pile. Mark's head snapped up, surprise replacing his defeated resignation. How do you know about Jessica? The same way I know about most things, I replied. Systematic investigation. Jessica Torres, 28 years old, works in the legal compliance department at Cascade Chemical Industries. You've been having an affair with her for approximately 8 months. I spread out financial records that clearly showed the pattern of his deception. Regular hotel charges, restaurant expenses for 2 people, jewelry purchases that coincided with what I assume were relationship milestones. The classic signature of an ongoing affair. Jessica isn't part of the organization, Mark said quickly, protective instincts overriding his caution. She's just someone I was involved with personally. Is she? I asked, studying his expression carefully. Because according to her employment records, Jessica Torres was hired at Cascade Chemical Industries approximately 6 months before you started your affair with her. Her previous employment was with a private investigation firm that specializes in corporate intelligence gathering. Mark's face went pale again. That's impossible. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your organization planted Jessica in your life to monitor your activities and ensure your continued loyalty to the operation. The affair you thought was a personal indulgence was actually another layer of professional surveillance. I watched Mark process this information, seeing him realize that he'd been just as manipulated as I had been. The difference was that I'd discovered the manipulation before it could be used to destroy me, while he'd been too arrogant to consider that he might not be the smartest person in the room. They've been watching you, Mark, I continued, probably since the beginning of our marriage, certainly since Emma was born. They needed to ensure that their operation remained secure and that you were following through on your assignments. What assignments? Gaining access to my professional network, gathering intelligence on my federal contacts, identifying which environmental investigations might threaten their clients' interests, I explained. You weren't just supposed to kill me, Mark. You were supposed to gather information that could be used to neutralize other environmental threats before eliminating me as a witness. Mark stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back with agitated energy. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I asked, pulling out my laptop and opening a secure file I'd accessed earlier that afternoon. This is a database of environmental investigators who have died under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. Car accidents, apparent suicides, sudden illnesses, unexplained disappearances. I rotated the screen so Mark could see the list of names and circumstances. 43 cases where experienced environmental professionals died or disappeared just as they were getting close to exposing major corporate environmental crimes. 43 cases where the deaths eliminated potential threats to profitable illegal operations. Mark stared at the screen, his face reflecting a growing understanding of the true scope of what he'd been part of. Sarah, this isn't what I thought I was involved in. What did you think you were involved in? Corporate damage control, he said weakly. Managing information flow, discrediting problematic investigators, creating alternative narratives about environmental incidents. I thought the more serious interventions were handled by other people. They were, I agreed, but you were being groomed to become one of those other people. The marriage, to me, was your final training exercise, proof that you could infiltrate an investigator's personal life and eliminate them when necessary. I closed the laptop and returned my attention to organizing the physical evidence. The problem with criminal organizations is that they eventually require their members to cross lines they never intended to cross. You started with financial fraud and information theft, but the logic of the operation inevitably led to murder. Mark returned to his chair, his head in his hands. What happens now? The sound of multiple vehicles pulling into our driveway cut through the tense silence that had settled between Mark and me. Through the kitchen window, I could see the distinctive black SUVs and unmarked sedans that announced the arrival of a federal task force. Agent Robert Chen stepped out of the lead vehicle, his familiar tall frame moving with the confident purpose that had made him one of the most effective environmental crime investigators in the Pacific Northwest. Mark's head shot up at the sound of car doors slamming shut, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They're really here, I confirmed, moving to check on Emma one final time before the controlled chaos of a federal investigation took over our home. Our daughter was still sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady, and her color healthier than it had been in months now that she was no longer being systematically poisoned. The doorbell rang with official authority, followed immediately by a firm knock that left no doubt about the seriousness of the visitors waiting outside. I walked calmly to the front door, noting how Mark remained frozen in his kitchen chair, apparently unable to process that his carefully planned operation had collapsed so completely. Agent Chen, I said, opening the door to my cousin's concerned face. Thank you for responding so quickly. Robert stepped inside, followed by 3 other federal agents whose professional demeanor immediately transformed our suburban home into a crime scene. Behind them came specialists carrying equipment cases and documentation materials, the full apparatus of a major federal investigation mobilizing in our living room. Sarah, Robert said, his voice carrying both professional authority and family concern. Are you and Emma safe? We're safe now, I replied, leading the team toward the kitchen where Mark waited. The immediate threat has been neutralized, but there's a lot you need to know about what we're dealing with. As we entered the kitchen, Mark looked up with the expression of a man watching his world collapse in real time. The federal agents arranged themselves strategically around the room, their presence instantly shifting the dynamic from a domestic confrontation to a criminal investigation. "Mark Mitchell," Agent Chen said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "I'm Agent Robert Chen with the Environmental Crimes Unit. We're here to investigate allegations of environmental terrorism, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of multiple federal statutes related to chemical weapons and public safety." Mark opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again without saying anything. The man who'd been so confident in his manipulations and murder plans seemed overwhelmed by the reality of facing actual consequences for his actions. "Mr. Mitchell has been very forthcoming about his activities," I said, gesturing to the evidence I'd organized on the kitchen table. "He's confessed to systematically poisoning our 6-month-old daughter and attempting to murder both Emma and me as part of a broader criminal conspiracy." Agent Chen's expression darkened as he surveyed the documentation spread across our table. "Mr. Mitchell, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "I understand my rights," Mark said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I want to cooperate fully with your investigation." One of the other agents, a woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Agent Patricia Williams, and I'll be coordinating the evidence collection and witness interviews. Mrs. Mitchell, we're going to need detailed statements about everything you've discovered and experienced." "Of course," I replied. "I've prepared preliminary documentation, but I'm sure you'll want to conduct your own analysis of the physical evidence." Agent Williams nodded approvingly. "We'll need to process this entire house as a crime scene, collect samples of the contaminated materials, and coordinate with medical professionals to document the extent of the poisoning. This is going to be a complex investigation." "There's more," Mark said suddenly, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "Sarah doesn't understand the full scope of what she's uncovered. This isn't just about our family. There's a network of operations across multiple states, involving dozens of companies and hundreds of potential victims." Agent Chen and I exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of Mark's statement. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough that environmental crime investigators hoped for, but rarely achieved. Direct access to the inner workings of a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Mitchell," Agent Chen said, settling into a chair across from Mark with the deliberate movements of an experienced interrogator. "Tell us about this network." Mark looked around the room at the assembled federal agents, seeming to realize that his only path forward involved complete honesty about everything he'd been part of. "It's called the Resource Protection Alliance, though that's just one of many names they use. They present themselves as a legitimate consulting firm that helps corporations manage environmental liability and regulatory compliance." "But that's not what they actually do," Agent Williams observed. "The legitimate consulting work is real, but it's cover for the primary operation," Mark continued. "They identify environmental investigators, regulators, journalists, and activists who pose significant threats to their clients' profitable activities. Then they develop strategies to neutralize those threats." I felt a chill run down my spine as Mark described the systematic nature of the organization he'd been part of. This wasn't just corporate corruption or environmental crime. It was a coordinated assault on the entire system of environmental protection and public safety oversight. "What kind of strategies?" Agent Chen asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "It starts with intelligence gathering," Mark explained. "They infiltrate the personal and professional lives of target individuals, gathering information about vulnerabilities, relationships, financial pressures, anything that could be used for manipulation or blackmail." Mark's eyes found mine across the table. "In my case, I was assigned to marry Sarah and gain access to her professional network. The goal was to identify which federal investigations might threaten their clients and gather intelligence that could be used to compromise those investigations." Agent Williams made notes on a tablet as Mark spoke. "And when intelligence gathering wasn't sufficient?" "They escalate," Mark said, his voice growing quieter. "Character assassination through planted evidence or manufactured scandals. Financial pressure through coordinated lawsuits or economic sabotage. Professional destruction through false allegations of misconduct or incompetence. And when those methods don't work? Agent Chen pressed. Mark was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the table. Physical elimination, made to look like accidents, suicides, or natural deaths. They have specialists who are very good at making murder look like anything else. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Agent Williams typing notes and the distant hum of other federal agents beginning their systematic processing of our home as a crime scene. The scope of what Mark was describing was staggering. A criminal organization that had essentially declared war on environmental protection through systematic intimidation and murder. How many people have been killed? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know the exact number, Mark admitted. Operations are compartmentalized. Each operative only knows about their own assignments and immediate contacts. But based on conversations I've overheard and references in planning documents, it's dozens. Maybe more. Agent Chen leaned forward, his expression intense. We're going to need names, locations, methods, everything you know about how this organization operates. I can give you everything about the Pacific Northwest operations, Mark said, but you need to understand that this is a national network with connections to major corporations, government officials, and law enforcement agencies. They have resources and influence that you might not be prepared for. Let us worry about our preparation, Agent Williams said firmly. Your job is to provide complete and accurate information about every aspect of this conspiracy. Mark nodded, then looked directly at me. Sarah, I need you to understand something. When they realize that this operation has been compromised, when they understand that you've survived and exposed their network, they're going to come after you with everything they have. They can try, I replied calmly. But they're dealing with federal law enforcement now, not an isolated individual they can intimidate or eliminate quietly. You don't understand, Mark insisted. They have people inside federal agencies. They know how investigations work, and they know how to neutralize threats before they can do serious damage to their operations. Agent Chen's expression hardened. Mr. Mitchell, are you suggesting that there are federal employees involved in this conspiracy? I'm saying that they have sources of information inside multiple agencies, Mark clarified. Whether those sources are willing participants or unknowing assets, I can't say for certain, but they always seem to know about investigations before they become public. This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. If Mark was correct about federal information sources, then the investigation would need to be conducted with extraordinary security measures to prevent the criminal network from learning about its progress and scope. We'll address those concerns as we develop our investigative strategy, Agent Chen said. For now, I want you to focus on providing detailed information about every aspect of your involvement with this organization. Over the next several hours, Mark provided a comprehensive account of his recruitment into the Resource Protection Alliance, his training in infiltration and intelligence gathering techniques, and his specific assignment to target me for elimination. The story that emerged was both more sophisticated and more horrifying than anything I'd imagined during my afternoon of discovery and confrontation. Mark had been recruited during his final year of law school by what appeared to be a legitimate environmental consulting firm, offering lucrative career opportunities for graduates with the right combination of intelligence, ambition, and moral flexibility. The initial assignments had seemed like standard corporate damage control, managing negative publicity, discrediting environmental activists through opposition research, and developing legal strategies to minimize corporate liability for environmental violations. The escalation had been gradual and carefully managed. Each assignment pushed ethical boundaries slightly further than the previous one, creating a pattern of incremental compromise that made it difficult to identify a clear line that shouldn't be crossed. By the time Mark realized he was part of a criminal conspiracy, he was too deeply involved to extract himself without facing serious personal consequences. The marriage assignment was presented as the ultimate test of my commitment and capabilities, Mark explained as federal agents continued their methodical documentation of evidence throughout our home. Successfully infiltrating Sarah's life and gaining access to her professional network would prove that I was ready for the most sensitive operations. And what were those operations? Agent Williams asked. Direct elimination of high-priority targets, Mark said, his voice flat with shame. Environmental investigators, who were getting too close to exposing major corporate crimes. Federal regulators who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Journalists who were pursuing stories that could damage important clients. I listened to Mark's confession with a mixture of professional fascination and personal horror. The man I'd shared a bed with for 4 years had been systematically trained to become a murderer, and I'd been his final training exercise before graduation to active killer status. The plan for Sarah and Emma was supposed to demonstrate my readiness to handle elimination operations, Mark continued. If I could successfully murder my own wife and daughter while maintaining my cover and positioning myself as a sympathetic victim, then I'd proven I had the psychological profile needed for the organization's most sensitive work. Agent Chen made careful notes as Mark described the specific techniques he'd been taught for murdering environmental investigators while avoiding detection. The methods were sophisticated and clearly developed through extensive experience. Chemical poisoning that mimicked natural illnesses, staged accidents that eliminated physical evidence, psychological manipulation that drove victims to suicide, and social isolation that made disappearances seem plausible. They've essentially industrialized murder, I observed, feeling sick as I understood the true scope of what we were dealing with. They prefer to think of it as strategic resource protection, Mark said with bitter irony. Every environmental investigator eliminated represents millions of dollars in saved cleanup costs and legal penalties for their corporate clients. From their perspective, murder is just another cost-effective business strategy. As the investigation continued into the evening, federal agents systematically collected evidence from throughout our home, while Mark provided detailed information about the Resource Protection Alliance's structure, methods, and known targets. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had effectively declared war on environmental protection through systematic intimidation and elimination of threats. Emma woke up during one of Agent Williams' questioning sessions, her cries cutting through the professional atmosphere that had taken over our kitchen. I picked her up gratefully, holding her close and marveling at how much better she looked after just a few days without being systematically poisoned. "She's beautiful," Agent Williams observed, her professional demeanor softening momentarily. "How long was she being poisoned?" "According to the medical timeline, approximately 4 months," I replied, gently rocking Emma as she settled back into sleepy contentment. Dr. Foster believes that a few more weeks of exposure at the levels Mark was using could have caused permanent developmental damage or death. Mark winced at this assessment, and for the first time during the investigation, I saw something that might have been genuine remorse in his expression. I never wanted Emma to suffer. The plan was supposed to be quick and painless. "There's no such thing as painless murder, Mr. Mitchell," Agent Chen said firmly. "And there's certainly no such thing as painless murder of an infant. You were systematically torturing a 6-month-old baby as part of an elaborate scheme to murder her mother." The bluntness of Agent Chen's assessment seemed to penetrate Mark's remaining psychological defenses. He broke down completely, sobbing with what appeared to be genuine anguish over what he'd done to Emma and attempted to do to me. "I'm sorry," he said through his tears, looking directly at me. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I'm genuinely sorry for what I put you and Emma through." I studied Mark's face, trying to determine whether his emotional breakdown represented authentic remorse or simply another manipulation technique. After everything I'd learned about his training in deception and psychological manipulation, it was impossible to trust any emotional display as genuine. "Your apology doesn't change what you did," I said finally. "But your cooperation with this investigation might prevent other families from experiencing what we've been through." Agent Chen nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Mitchell is correct. Your best option now is complete honesty about every aspect of this organization's operations. The more information you provide, the more lives you might save by helping us dismantle this network." "I'll tell you everything I know," Mark promised, his voice still thick with emotion. "Every name, every method, every target I'm aware of. If it helps stop them from hurting other families, then maybe some good can come from this nightmare." As the federal investigation continued late into the night, I felt a strange sense of closure settling over me. The marriage I'd thought was built on love had actually been an elaborate deception, designed to facilitate my murder. But discovering that truth had also revealed my own strength and provided an opportunity to expose a criminal conspiracy that threatened environmental investigators across the country. Emma slept peacefully in my arms, safe from the poison that had been slowly destroying her health for months. Mark sat at our kitchen table, providing detailed information that would help federal agents dismantle a network of murderers masquerading as environmental consultants. And I finally understood exactly who I was and what I was capable of when the people I loved were threatened. The woman who'd blamed herself for her daughter's mysterious illness was gone, replaced by someone who'd successfully identified and neutralized a sophisticated murder plot, while positioning herself to help federal authorities expose a national conspiracy. Mark had been right about one thing. This was much bigger than our family. But he'd been wrong about everything else, especially his assumption that I could be easily manipulated and eliminated. The Resource Protection Alliance had made a fatal error when they assigned Mark to infiltrate my life. Instead of gaining access to intelligence that could compromise environmental investigations, they'd provided federal law enforcement with direct access to their operations and methods. Their elaborate murder plot had become the foundation for their own destruction. As Agent Chen prepared to transport Mark to federal custody for continued questioning, I felt a profound sense of transformation settling over me. The passive victim who'd endured months of psychological manipulation and chemical poisoning was gone forever. In her place stood someone who'd proven capable of protecting her child, exposing a criminal conspiracy, and working with federal authorities to ensure that justice was served. "Mrs. Mitchell," Agent Chen said as the formal evidence collection concluded, "I want you to know that your actions tonight have potentially saved dozens of lives. This investigation is going to be challenging and dangerous, but you've given us the breakthrough we needed to seriously damage this organization." "What happens next?" I asked, still holding Emma close as federal agents prepared to leave our home. "We'll be providing protection for you and Emma while we develop the investigation," Agent Williams explained. "This organization doesn't respond well to exposure, and there's a significant risk that they'll attempt retaliation." "Let them try," I said, feeling completely calm about the prospect of facing whatever threats might emerge. They chose the wrong family to target, and now they're going to face the consequences of that mistake. As the federal vehicles pulled away from our house with Mark in custody, I stood in my doorway holding Emma and looking out at the quiet suburban street where we'd lived what I'd thought was a normal life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the federal investigation expanded, and the Resource Protection Alliance realized their carefully planned operation had been completely compromised. But tonight, for the first time in months, Emma and I were truly safe. The poison was out of her system, the threat to our lives had been neutralized, and the criminal organization that had targeted us was about to discover that their latest victims were far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. 3 months after Mark's arrest, I stood in the conference room of the Pacific Northwest Regional FBI office, looking out at an assembly of federal agents, environmental investigators, and prosecutors, who represented the largest coordinated response to environmental terrorism in U.S. history. The Resource Protection Alliance investigation had expanded far beyond anything we'd initially imagined, uncovering a criminal network that spanned 12 states and involved over 200 active operatives. Emma sat contentedly in her carrier beside my chair, babbling happily at the morning sunlight streaming through the conference room windows. Her health had returned completely after the chemical poisoning ended, and her pediatrician marveled at her resilience and rapid recovery. Dr. Rodriguez had become something of a crusader herself, developing new protocols for detecting chemical poisoning in infants and publishing papers that would help other medical professionals identify similar cases. Agent Chen moved to the front of the room, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd spent years building toward this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the cooperation of Sarah Mitchell and the intelligence provided by Mark Mitchell, we've achieved unprecedented success in dismantling what we now understand was the most sophisticated environmental terrorism network in American history." The presentation that followed detailed the scope of the Resource Protection Alliance's activities with a thoroughness that still shocked me despite months of investigation. They'd successfully eliminated 47 environmental investigators, regulators, and journalists over a 5-year period. They'd infiltrated 11 federal agencies and manipulated dozens of environmental investigations to protect corporate clients from criminal liability. They'd generated over $2 billion in illegal profits for corporations that would otherwise have faced massive cleanup costs and legal penalties. The financial scope alone makes this one of the largest criminal conspiracies ever prosecuted in federal court, Agent Williams added, advancing to a slide showing the network's financial structure. But the human cost is what makes this case unprecedented. We're dealing with systematic murder of American citizens who were trying to protect public health and environmental safety. I listened to the briefing with mixed emotions. Pride at having played a crucial role in exposing such a massive criminal conspiracy, horror at understanding how many lives had been lost, and determination to ensure that something like this never happened again. The woman who'd blamed herself for her daughter's mysterious illness had evolved into someone who was actively reshaping how federal agencies responded to environmental crime. Mrs. Mitchell, Agent Chen said, turning toward me, would you like to address the task force about the ongoing investigation? I stood up, adjusting Emma's carrier and feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being the primary witness in such a significant case. 3 months ago, I thought I was dealing with a failing marriage and a sick baby. I had no idea that my husband was part of a criminal organization that had declared war on environmental protection. The room was completely silent as I continued. What I've learned since then is that the Resource Protection Alliance succeeded for so long because they understood how to exploit our assumptions about normal life. They counted on environmental investigators being so focused on their professional work that they wouldn't notice personal threats. They relied on federal agencies treating environmental crimes as regulatory violations rather than acts of terrorism. I moved to the presentation screen, advancing to a slide that showed the network of connections we'd uncovered. But they made a fundamental error in their operational assumptions. They believed that environmental investigators were isolated individuals who could be eliminated one at a time without triggering coordinated response. They didn't understand that we're actually part of a professional community with deep connections and mutual support systems. The past 3 months had been a revelation in professional networking and collaborative investigation. Once word spread through the environmental consulting community about what had happened to my family, dozens of investigators came forward with information about suspicious deaths, mysterious accidents, and unusual circumstances surrounding colleagues who died while working on sensitive cases. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, my former colleague from Portland State University, had established a database of suspicious deaths among environmental professionals that revealed patterns the Resource Protection Alliance had assumed would remain hidden. What they'd thought were isolated eliminations were actually part of a detectable pattern when analyzed systematically. The intelligence we've gathered over the past 3 months represents the largest collection of evidence about environmental terrorism ever assembled, I continued. But more importantly, it represents a fundamental shift in how our professional community approaches personal security and threat assessment. Agent Williams nodded approvingly. Mrs. Mitchell has been instrumental in developing new protocols for environmental investigators working on sensitive cases. These protocols have already prevented 2 attempted infiltration operations that we've identified. The prevention successes were particularly satisfying. Armed with detailed information about the Resource Protection Alliance's methods, federal authorities had been able to identify and intercept 2 ongoing operations where criminals were attempting to infiltrate the personal lives of environmental investigators working on major corporate contamination cases. In one case, a woman very similar to Mark had been courting a female EPA inspector who was investigating illegal chemical disposal by a major manufacturing company. Federal surveillance had revealed that the man was actually a trained operative attempting to gain access to classified investigation materials. His arrest had led to additional intelligence about Resource Protection Alliance recruiting and training methods. The broader impact of this investigation extends far beyond the specific criminal prosecutions, I said, advancing to the final slide of my presentation. We've fundamentally changed how environmental crimes are investigated and prosecuted in this country. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Environmental crimes that had previously been handled as regulatory violations were now being treated as potential terrorism cases. Federal agencies that had previously worked independently were now sharing intelligence and coordinating investigations. Most importantly, environmental investigators who had previously worked in isolation were now part of a coordinated network with security protocols and mutual support systems. I'd like to address the personal transformation that this experience has created, I said, my voice carrying a strength that still surprised me sometimes. 3 months ago, I was someone who apologized for everything, who blamed herself when things went wrong, who accepted other people's assessments of her worth and capabilities. Emma chose that moment to gurgle happily, as though she was participating in the presentation. The sound drew smiles from the assembled federal agents, and reminded everyone that this case was ultimately about protecting families and communities from criminal enterprises that treated human lives as acceptable business expenses. The woman who let her husband systematically poison her and her daughter while making excuses for his behavior is gone, I continued. She's been replaced by someone who understands her own value and capabilities, someone who refuses to accept artificial limitations imposed by people who benefit from her diminished expectations. The personal transformation had been as significant as the professional one. The passive victim who'd endured Mark's psychological manipulation and chemical poisoning had evolved into someone who was actively working to protect other families from similar threats. I'd become a federal consultant specializing in environmental terrorism prevention, using my experience as both an investigator and a victim to develop more effective protection strategies. But the most important transformation has been understanding that individual strength is most effective when it's part of collective action, I said, looking around the room at the federal agents and investigators who'd become colleagues and friends over the past 3 months. The Resource Protection Alliance succeeded by isolating their targets and eliminating them one at a time. We've defeated them by building connections and working together. Agent Chen stepped forward as I concluded my presentation. The intelligence and cooperation that Mrs. Mitchell has provided has been essential to our success in this investigation. Her willingness to testify in federal court and work with our ongoing security efforts has made it possible to dismantle this network completely. The federal prosecutions had been swift and comprehensive. Mark's cooperation had provided enough evidence to secure indictments against 63 members of the Resource Protection Alliance across 12 states. The organization's financial assets had been frozen and seized. Their corporate clients were facing massive federal investigations, and their methods had been exposed publicly in ways that would make it impossible for similar organizations to operate using the same techniques. Mark Mitchell's sentencing is scheduled for next week, Agent Williams announced. Given his complete cooperation with the investigation and the intelligence he's provided about ongoing operations, he'll receive a reduced sentence of 25 years in federal prison. I felt no satisfaction about Mark's imprisonment, but also no regret. He'd made choices that led directly to this outcome, and his cooperation with the investigation had probably saved dozens of lives by helping federal authorities identify and prevent planned murders. The man who'd tried to kill Emma and me for insurance money had ultimately become instrumental in exposing and dismantling the criminal organization he'd been part of. What about Jessica Torres? Someone asked from the audience. Ms. Torres has also been extremely cooperative, Agent Chen replied. Her surveillance of Mr. Mitchell was part of her assigned duties within the organization, but she provided crucial intelligence about their operational security and internal communications. She'll serve 18 months in federal prison and has agreed to ongoing cooperation with our investigation. The Jessica Torres situation had been particularly complex to navigate. Her relationship with Mark had indeed been a professional assignment designed to monitor his activities and ensure his loyalty to the organization. But her cooperation with federal authorities had provided valuable insight into how the Resource Protection Alliance managed their operatives and maintained operational security. The broader investigation continues, Agent Williams added. We've identified Resource Protection Alliance operations in 8 additional states, and international law enforcement agencies have expressed interest in our intelligence about potential operations overseas. The international dimension had been an unexpected development. Evidence from the Resource Protection Alliance investigation suggested that similar organizations were operating in Europe and Asia, providing corporate clients with the same services of systematic elimination of environmental threats. The techniques developed for the American investigation were now being shared with law enforcement agencies worldwide. Mrs. Mitchell, could you speak about the ongoing security concerns? Agent Chen asked. The Resource Protection Alliance as an organization has been effectively dismantled, I replied. But individual operatives who weren't captured in the initial arrests represent ongoing threats. Federal authorities have provided security protection for Emma and me, But more importantly, we've developed threat assessment protocols that make it much harder for criminal organizations to target environmental investigators. The security measures had become part of normal life rather than emergency precautions. Emma and I lived in a secure location with regular federal protection, but we also maintained normal activities and social connections. The goal wasn't to hide from potential threats, but to make those threats detectable and preventable through systematic security protocols. The most effective security measure has been community awareness, I continued. Environmental investigators are no longer working in isolation. We've established communication networks and mutual support systems that make it impossible for criminal organizations to eliminate individuals without triggering coordinated response. The professional network that had emerged from the Resource Protection Alliance investigation was probably the most significant long-term impact of the case. Environmental investigators who had previously worked independently were now part of a coordinated community with shared resources, mutual protection protocols, and collective advocacy for stronger federal protection of environmental professionals. I'd like to conclude by addressing the question of personal worth that's been central to my experience, I said, returning to the themes that had defined my transformation over the past 3 months. Mark called me worthless when he thought I was just a suburban mother who could be easily manipulated and eliminated. He was wrong about my worth, but more importantly, he was wrong about what constitutes worth. Emma reached up from her carrier, grabbing my finger with the strong grip that had returned as the chemical poisoning left her system. Her bright eyes and healthy complexion were visible proof that we'd not only survived the Resource Protection Alliance's murder plot, but emerged stronger and more capable than before. Worth isn't determined by other people's assessments or limitations, I continued. It's not measured by professional achievements or financial success or social status. Worth is demonstrated through the choices we make when faced with challenges, the way we respond to threats against the people we love, and our willingness to use our capabilities to protect others from similar dangers. The room fell silent as I paused, looking around at the federal agents and investigators who'd become partners in a mission that extended far beyond prosecuting the specific criminals who'd targeted my family. We were working together to build systems that would prevent future Resource Protection Alliance-type organizations from successfully targeting environmental protections through systematic intimidation and murder. The woman who was called worthless 6 months ago has helped federal authorities dismantle the largest environmental terrorism network in American history, I said, feeling the profound truth of that statement settle over the room. But that's not what makes me valuable. What makes me valuable is the same thing that made me valuable before Mark tried to poison me and Emma: my willingness to use my capabilities to protect people and communities from environmental harm. Agent Chen stepped forward as I concluded, his expression carrying both professional respect and family pride. The Resource Protection Alliance investigation represents a fundamental shift in how we approach environmental crimes in this country. Thanks to Mrs. Mitchell's courage and cooperation, we've moved from treating environmental crimes as regulatory violations to recognizing them as potential terrorism threats requiring coordinated federal response. As the briefing concluded and federal agents began discussing implementation strategies for the new protocols we'd developed, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from discovering that my husband was poisoning our daughter to helping dismantle a national criminal conspiracy had revealed capabilities and strength I hadn't known I possessed. Emma dozed peacefully in her carrier as I gathered my materials, completely secure in the knowledge that she was safe from the chemical poisoning that had nearly killed her, and protected by federal security measures that would prevent future attempts to harm our family. The baby who'd been systematically poisoned for months had not only recovered completely, but had inadvertently triggered the investigation that exposed and dismantled the criminal organization responsible. Dr. Rodriguez appeared at my side as I prepared to leave, her warm smile carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd played a crucial role in protecting a child and exposing a conspiracy. "Emma looks wonderful," she observed, gently stroking our daughter's soft hair. Her latest tests show no residual effects from the chemical exposure. "She's completely healthy," I confirmed. "And according to the federal psychologists, she's unlikely to have any memory of the period when she was being poisoned. She'll grow up knowing that her mother helped stop criminals who were hurting children, but she won't carry trauma from her own experience." "That's the best possible outcome," Dr. Rodriguez agreed. And the protocols we've developed for detecting chemical poisoning in infants are already being implemented in pediatric practices nationwide. Emma's case is going to help protect other children from similar crimes. As we walked toward the federal building's exit, I reflected on the unexpected ways that personal trauma could become the foundation for broader social change. My discovery that Mark was poisoning Emma had seemed like an isolated family crisis, but it had actually been the key to exposing a criminal conspiracy that threatened environmental investigators and their families across the country. "Mrs. Mitchell," Agent Williams called out as we reached the building lobby, "I wanted to personally thank you for your ongoing cooperation with this investigation. The intelligence you've provided has been invaluable, and your willingness to testify in federal court has made successful prosecutions possible." "It's been my privilege to work with federal law enforcement on this case," I replied honestly. Discovering that my husband was part of a criminal organization that murdered environmental investigators made cooperation with your investigation a personal mission as well as a civic duty. The elevator doors opened to reveal Agent Chen, waiting to escort us to our secure transportation. "Sarah, I know this hasn't been easy for you and Emma, but I want you to understand the broader impact of what you've accomplished." As we rode down to the parking garage, he continued, "The Resource Protection Alliance represented one of the most serious threats to environmental protection that we've ever identified. Their systematic elimination of investigators and regulators was undermining the entire framework of environmental law enforcement. Your discovery of Mark's activities and your cooperation with our investigation has literally saved the environmental protection system in this country." I absorbed this assessment as we walked toward the armored vehicle that would transport Emma and me back to our secure residence. The scope of what we'd accomplished still seemed almost too large to comprehend fully. A routine investigation into my daughter's mysterious illness had uncovered and helped dismantle a criminal conspiracy that had murdered dozens of people and threatened the foundations of environmental protection. "What happens next?" I asked as federal agents conducted their security check of our vehicle. "The prosecutions will continue for several more months," Agent Chen replied. "The international investigations are just beginning, and the security protocols we've developed will become standard practice for environmental investigators working on sensitive cases. And personally, you and Emma are safe," he assured me. "The immediate threats have been eliminated, and the ongoing security measures will prevent future attempts to retaliate against your family. But more importantly, you've established yourself as one of the leading experts on environmental terrorism prevention. That's a career that can continue for as long as you choose to pursue it." As our secure vehicle pulled away from the federal building, I looked back at the structure that had become the headquarters for the investigation that had transformed my life. 6 months ago, I'd been a suburban mother who blamed herself for her daughter's illness and accepted her husband's assessment of her worth and capabilities. Today, I was a federal consultant whose expertise was helping protect environmental investigators and their families from criminal organizations that targeted them for elimination. Emma stirred in her car seat, her eyes opening to take in the familiar sights of Portland's downtown skyline. She had no memory of the months when she'd been systematically poisoned, no awareness of the criminal conspiracy that had targeted our family for elimination. She would grow up knowing only that her mother was someone who helped protect people from bad individuals who tried to hurt families. The secure residence where we now lived was comfortable and safe, but it was also temporary. Federal authorities expected that within another 6 months, the ongoing security concerns would be resolved sufficiently that Emma and I could return to normal life. But normal life would look very different from what we'd experienced before Mark's arrest. My consulting practice had evolved to specialize in environmental terrorism prevention, working with federal agencies and private organizations to develop security protocols for investigators working on sensitive cases. The work was meaningful, well compensated, and allowed me to use both my technical expertise and my personal experience to protect others from the threats we'd faced. "Mama," Emma said clearly, one of her first recognizable words emerging as we drove through the city where we'd nearly been murdered, and where we'd ultimately helped expose a national criminal conspiracy. "Yes, baby?" I replied, reaching back to hold her small hand. "Mama's here." The word carried more weight than Emma could possibly understand. She was calling to the woman who'd saved her life by recognizing that her illness wasn't random, who'd outsmarted a sophisticated murder plot, who'd helped federal authorities dismantle a criminal organization that had terrorized environmental investigators for years. But more importantly, she was calling to the woman who'd discovered her own worth through the process of protecting her daughter from people who'd tried to eliminate them both. As our vehicle pulled into the secure garage of our temporary residence, I felt a profound sense of peace about the future. Emma and I had not only survived the Resource Protection Alliance's murder plot, we'd emerged stronger and more capable than before. The criminal organization that had targeted us for elimination had instead triggered their own destruction through their failure to understand who they were really dealing with. The woman Mark had called worthless had proven her value beyond any measure he could have imagined. But that wasn't the point anymore. The point was that worth had never been determined by his assessment or anyone else's external evaluation. Worth was demonstrated through choices and actions, through the willingness to protect others and the courage to stand up against those who tried to harm innocent people. Emma fell asleep as we settled into our secure home, her peaceful breathing a reminder that we'd not only escaped the threats that had nearly destroyed us, but had used that experience to build something better for ourselves and for other families facing similar dangers. The Resource Protection Alliance was gone, their methods exposed, their operatives imprisoned, and their corporate clients facing federal investigation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation continued and the prosecutions moved forward through federal court. But tonight, Emma and I were safe, healthy, and surrounded by the security of knowing that we'd proven ourselves capable of facing whatever threats might emerge in the future. The journey from victim to survivor to protector was complete, but the mission of ensuring that no other family would face what we'd experienced was just beginning. And I was more than ready for whatever came next. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of my new office at the Environmental Protection Agency's Pacific Northwest Regional Headquarters, illuminating the framed photograph on my desk of Emma taking her first steps in the secure garden behind our temporary residence. At 15 months old, she was thriving with the boundless energy and curiosity that had returned once the chemical poisoning ended, completely unaware that her recovery had become a symbol of hope for environmental investigators across the country. I set down my coffee cup, noting with satisfaction that it was coffee I'd made myself in my own office kitchen. A small but meaningful reminder of how completely my life had transformed since discovering that Mark had been systematically poisoning both Emma and me. The woman who'd once accepted her husband's daily delivery of contaminated coffee had evolved into someone who controlled every aspect of her environment and security. The knock on my office door interrupted my morning review of case files, and Agent Chen entered with the confident stride that had become familiar over the months of investigation and prosecution. "Sarah, the final sentencing hearing is scheduled for this afternoon. Are you prepared for Mark's allocution?" I nodded, feeling remarkably calm about the prospect of seeing my former husband in federal court one last time. "I've reviewed my victim impact statement, and I'm ready to address the court about the ongoing effects of his crimes." The legal proceedings had stretched over nearly a year, with Mark's case serving as the cornerstone prosecution in the broader dismantling of the Resource Protection Alliance. His cooperation with federal authorities had been genuine and comprehensive, providing intelligence that led to the arrest and conviction of 68 additional conspirators across 14 states. But cooperation couldn't erase the fact that he'd systematically poisoned an infant and attempted to murder his wife as part of a calculated financial scheme. "The judge indicated that she wants to hear directly from you about the impact on Emma's health and development," Agent Chen continued, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Your testimony has been crucial throughout this investigation, and today's hearing will formally close the chapter on Mark's involvement." I thought about Emma, who was spending the morning at the federal daycare center that had been established specifically for the children of environmental investigators working on sensitive cases. She was happy, healthy, and developing normally, with no lasting effects from the months of chemical exposure that had nearly killed her. But the trauma of discovering that her father had been trying to murder us both would always be part of our family story. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "Not for Mark's sake, but for my own peace of mind and Emma's future understanding of what happened to us." Agent Chen raised an eyebrow, his expression suggesting he wasn't sure forgiveness was appropriate, given the severity of Mark's crimes. That's a personal decision, but I hope you remember that his actions were part of a systematic campaign of terrorism against environmental protection. I haven't forgotten, I assured him, but I've learned that carrying anger and hatred takes energy that I'd rather invest in preventing other families from experiencing what we went through. The past year had been a masterclass in channeling trauma into productive action. My work with the EPA's new Environmental Terrorism Prevention Unit had helped develop security protocols that were already protecting investigators working on sensitive cases. The database of suspicious deaths among environmental professionals had been expanded into a comprehensive threat assessment system that could identify patterns of criminal targeting before they escalated to actual violence. Speaking of prevention, Agent Chen said, pulling out a tablet and opening a secure file, we've identified 2 potential Resource Protection Alliance successor organizations attempting to recruit former operatives. Your expertise in recognizing their methods has been invaluable in developing countermeasures. I reviewed the intelligence report with the analytical skills that had been sharpened through months of federal collaboration. The criminal networks were adapting to the law enforcement pressure by fragmenting into smaller, more specialized operations, but they were still following the same basic strategy of eliminating environmental threats through systematic intimidation and murder. They're making the same fundamental error, I observed, noting patterns in the recruitment materials that revealed continued underestimation of their targets. They still assume that environmental investigators are isolated individuals who can be eliminated without triggering coordinated response. That assumption served them well for years, Agent Chen acknowledged. But your case proved that their operational security depended on victims remaining passive and authorities treating environmental crimes as regulatory violations rather than terrorism threats. The transformation in law enforcement approach had been one of the most significant outcomes of the Resource Protection Alliance investigation. Environmental crimes that might previously have been handled by regulatory agencies were now treated as potential terrorism cases requiring coordinated federal response. The shift had already prevented several attempted infiltration operations and led to early identification of criminal networks before they could establish operational capability. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Rodriguez, who was attending a pediatric conference where she was presenting research on chemical poisoning detection in infants. Emma's case study is generating significant interest among pediatricians nationwide. The protocols we developed are being adopted by children's hospitals across the country. I smiled, feeling proud that Emma's suffering had ultimately contributed to protecting other children from similar crimes. The medical community's response to learning about systematic chemical poisoning of infants had been swift and comprehensive, with new training programs and detection protocols being implemented to ensure that future cases would be identified much more quickly. Have you given any thought to the book proposal? Agent Chen asked, referring to an offer from a major publisher who wanted me to write about my experience exposing the Resource Protection Alliance. I'm considering it, I replied honestly. If sharing our story helps other families recognize when they're being targeted and encourages environmental investigators to take security threats seriously, then it might be worth the loss of privacy. The decision was complicated by concerns about Emma's future privacy and safety. While the immediate threats from the Resource Protection Alliance had been eliminated, publishing a detailed account of our experience would inevitably attract attention from other criminal organizations and potentially compromise the security protocols we'd worked so hard to establish. The federal marshals believe that publication wouldn't significantly increase security risks, Agent Chen said, reading my concerns accurately. Your identity as the primary witness in this case is already public record, and the security measures we've established are designed to handle ongoing threats. I nodded, understanding that the decision would ultimately come down to whether sharing our story could prevent other families from experiencing what we'd endured. The isolation and self-doubt that had made me vulnerable to Mark's manipulation were common experiences among environmental investigators, particularly women who faced additional challenges in male-dominated fields. The intercom on my desk buzzed with a call from my assistant. Ms. Mitchell, Director Walsh is here for your noon meeting about the international coordination protocols. Dr. Jennifer Walsh entered my office with the energetic purpose that had made her one of the most effective environmental investigation coordinators in the Pacific Northwest. Sarah, the European Union investigators are requesting a full briefing on our threat assessment methodologies. They've identified what appears to be a Resource Protection Alliance-type organization operating in Germany and Belgium. I felt a familiar surge of determination as we discussed the international dimensions of environmental terrorism. The criminal methods that had nearly destroyed my family were being exported globally, with corporations in multiple countries using similar tactics to eliminate environmental oversight through systematic intimidation and murder. We'll provide complete cooperation, I decided. If our experience can help European authorities identify and dismantle these networks before they become established, then Emma's suffering will have contributed to protecting families worldwide. The meeting with Dr. Walsh stretched through lunch as we developed plans for international cooperation and information sharing. The protocols we'd established for the United States were being adapted for different legal and cultural contexts, but the fundamental principles remained consistent. Environmental investigators needed coordinated security measures and rapid response capabilities to survive systematic criminal targeting. As afternoon approached and the time for Mark's sentencing hearing drew near, I found myself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred since that evening, when I'd confronted him in our kitchen with the toxicology report that revealed his crimes. The woman who'd blamed herself for Emma's illness and accepted her husband's psychological manipulation was gone, replaced by someone who'd proven capable of protecting her child and helping federal authorities dismantle a national criminal conspiracy. Emma had been picked up from daycare and was napping peacefully in the travel crib I kept in my office for days when federal duties extended beyond normal working hours. She slept with the deep contentment of a healthy child who'd never known hunger or fear, completely unaware that her recovery from systematic poisoning had become a symbol of hope for environmental investigators facing criminal threats. The drive to the federal courthouse took me through downtown Portland neighborhoods where I'd once lived a carefully controlled suburban life, believing that my worth was determined by Mark's assessment and that my capabilities were limited to whatever roles he deemed appropriate. The woman who'd accepted those limitations had discovered strengths and skills that she'd never imagined possessing, but more importantly, she'd learned that worth was demonstrated through choices and actions rather than external validation. Agent Chen met me in the courthouse lobby, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully concluded one of the most significant environmental terrorism investigations in federal law enforcement history. The courtroom is packed with environmental investigators and federal agents who've worked on this case. Your testimony today will formally close this chapter, but it will also demonstrate the broader impact of what we've accomplished together. As we walked toward the courtroom where Mark would receive his final sentence, I felt a profound sense of closure about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The discovery that my husband was poisoning our daughter had seemed like an isolated family tragedy, but it had actually been the key to exposing and dismantling a criminal conspiracy that had terrorized environmental investigators for years. The woman who'd been called worthless had proven her value beyond any measure that Mark could have imagined. But more importantly, she'd learned that worth was never determined by other people's assessments or limitations. Worth was demonstrated through the courage to protect others and the willingness to use personal trauma as a foundation for broader social change. Emma stirred in my arms as we entered the federal courthouse, her bright eyes taking in the marble columns and formal atmosphere with the curious intelligence that had returned as the chemical poisoning left her system. She would grow up knowing that her mother was someone who helped protect families from criminals who tried to hurt children, but she would never carry trauma from her own experience of being systematically poisoned as an infant. The courtroom doors opened ahead of us, and I prepared to deliver my final testimony in the case that had transformed my understanding of my own capabilities and worth. Mark's sentencing would conclude the legal proceedings, but the mission of ensuring that no other family would face what we'd experienced was just beginning. And I was ready for whatever came next. Secure in the knowledge that Emma and I had not only survived the Resource Protection Alliance's murder plot, but had used that experience to build something better for ourselves and for other families facing similar threats. The woman who'd been called worthless had proven herself beyond any doubt, and more importantly, she'd learned that her value had never depended on anyone else's assessment in the first place. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.